My work starts with the observation that social and moral evaluation is ubiquitous in adults. Despite cultural and individual variation, humans in general are a highly judgmental bunch. And in the moral domain in particular, we see certain behaviors as good, right, and deserving of reward, and others as bad, wrong, deserving of punishment. And the tendency to do that, again, despite individual and cultural variation, is itself universal. Okay, so where does this tendency come from? One possibility is that it comes from explicit internalization of societal norms. So, for example, our parents and our religious leaders and our peers literally tell us the kinds of things that are good to do and the kinds of things that are bad to do, and we internalize those teachings ourselves. Other processes might involve experience, over time and struggle. We discover that helping and cooperating ends up resulting in better outcomes for us and for others. We might experience being the target of bad antisocial behavior and know that that's leads to bad feelings. And we might observe others having these same experiences and infer that the effects they're experiencing would apply to ourselves. Okay, so essentially, decades of research in moral development tells us that both of these things are absolutely part of moral development. Internalization, socialization, and experience are critical for moral development. But my question is whether these are everything. Whether there's anything else that humans are bringing to the table that are outside of these clearly important processes. This question is backed by a theoretical perspective of the evolution of cooperation. The perspective that morality is itself the result of the evolution of cooperation. And by cooperation, I mean many different things. It could be group hunting, it could be caring for young, it could be any of the things that humans tend to do together as opposed to alone. And the argument is to cooperate safely, humans need mechanisms to first distinguish good cooperators from bad ones, friends from foes, so that would require evaluating others based on their tendency to be a good or a bad cooperator. And second, to influence other social behaviors, so to do things like include the good guys and exclude the bad guys, to selectively cooperate with the good ones rather than the bad ones, and even to do things like rewarding good behaviors so that they are boosted and punishing bad behaviors so that they are diminished. And the essential argument is because humans are arguably the most cooperative species on the planet, at least the most cooperative species with individuals we're not directly related to, we should also be the most evaluative species and the most retributive. Okay, so in order to pursue these questions, I hope to determine what, if anything, develops in the absence of those candidate experiences, or at least when those experiences are far less likely to be the sole driver of an aspect of development. Language, teaching, enculturation, and specific personal experiences being sort of helped and harmed in various ways. So we just examined populations with much less of these experiences, not none of them, but much less. Human infants, and asked to what extent preverbal infants' evaluations and behaviors map onto adults' moral judgments and tendencies. Okay, so all I wish to convince you of is that the answer is more than you might think. Okay. So our basic methodologies involve various puppet shows in which there is one character who has an unfulfilled goal that he's unable to achieve, and he is facilitated in his goal by the helper and prevented from achieving his goal by the hinderer. We do this in various ways, but here's 3 classic versions. Pardon me. In all of these studies, the infants are shown these behaviors over and over again until they're habituated, typically to helping and hindering. And of course, we always counterbalance, who did the helping and who did the hindering on a particular day for a particular baby. We also counterbalance order and side and all of the other relevant things. Okay, so in our hill scenario, sound was working before. That's odd. Oh, there we go. Okay. Should I play that one again? It's better with sound. Okay, so that's the helper. The guy tries to get up the hill, and then the yellow guy pushes him. That's the hindering act. This time the guy pushed the character down the hill. Here's our ball scenario. So the guy asks for his ball back repeatedly, and one guy rolls it back to him. When the hinderer gets the ball, he runs away with it. Okay. Our box scenario looks like this. And our hindering version looks like that. Okay, so essentially infants are shown these events until they're habituated, and then we ask them to tell us what they thought about the characters via a simple choice procedure. So here's what it looks like when infants choose between the puppets from the hill, okay, here's, that baby's probably like 15 now. Here's a baby more recently, choosing between bone replicas of the characters. When babies choose between hand puppets, in early studies we found that as soon as they saw a puppet, they just reached for it, so we need to make sure that they looked at both, back to the experimenter, and then just so we make sure that they know that there's two to choose between. We don't get terribly lot amount of hugging, but it does happen occasionally. She's not the only one to hug puppets. And with our very youngest age group, 3-month-olds, they're not physically capable of reaching out for objects yet, and so we must do a preferential looking procedure as opposed to a preferential reaching procedure. But basically it's the same. We just hold the characters up in front of their faces. And you can see that despite kind of like her head shaking around, she is able to sort of like direct her eyes back and forth between the two puppets, and we do that for 30 seconds and count the number of seconds they looked at each one. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a large set of results. Basically, all of my graphs will look like this. The conditions will be along the x-axis, and the percent of infants choosing the prosocial versus the antisocial puppet will be along the y-axis. And this is just a whole lot of samples, some of them published, some of them not published. There's about 400 infants represented on this slide. And as you can see, there's a lot more blue here than there is purple. Overall, we tend to find that babies prefer the helpful to the unhelpful puppets. We occasionally don't find significant effects, but as you can see across the board, it seems to be the case that babies, as it were, do prefer more helpful to less helpful puppets. And one thing to point out is that we actually think that the box show probably has the lowest effect size versus the other ones, so we are more likely to find occasional non-significant effects when it's the box show versus the other shows. Okay, the other thing to notice is that this is by age, so age gets smaller as you go across, and we don't actually find any differences in effect size across age. So 3-month-olds are showing just as strong of a tendency to prefer the helper as 10-month-olds are in this graph. Okay. So on average, it's about 75% of babies that are preferring helpers to hinderers across studies, suggesting it's a fairly robust effect, although not every baby does it all of the time. Okay. So what about other replications? There have been conceptual replications of a tendency to prefer helpers to hinderers from a number of other labs throughout the years, suggesting that it's not only us that can find these effects. Also, there are preferences in the literature for fair over unfair individuals, largely from the Somerville lab at Washington, but not solely, suggesting again that infants are sensitive to things within the moral domain. That said, there are failed replications out there. We've had a few, and there are several published in the literature. Some, I think, are due to pretty strong procedural differences between the ways we do it and the ways that it was done in these other studies, but some of them not. So, for example, the Salvador et al. Paper was a failure with the box show, and we actually helped them quite a bit before they started their study, and they still failed to replicate. This is another reason I think the box show is a little bit less robust than the other shows. Okay. A recent meta-analysis, including both published data and unpublished data, and accounting for potential publication bias, estimated that the rate of choosing helpers to hinderers is more like 2/3. In our lab, we find that it's about 3/4. This meta-analysis suggests that it's about 2/3. So still robust, still definitely an effect there, but maybe slightly less than what we've observed in our lab. Okay. We can have questions, right? Or,
of course.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, feel free to. Yeah. Well, it feels like a small group, and then I'm like, no. Okay, so anyway, feel free to ask questions if you want, otherwise I'll just
And we'll save time at the end, too.
Okay, great. Okay, so our lab has been really interested in sort of what is going on in babies' head when they're deciding to like helpers over hinderers, or in which they are ending up liking helpers over hinderers. And so one of the ways we've approached this question is to ask what is it in fact that they're evaluating, and this is at a pretty broad level. The question could be well, maybe babies prefer helpers because they actually dislike hinderers. Maybe babies prefer helpers because they like helping, or maybe both is happening. So you can imagine one or the other or both driving the fact that babies reach for helper versus hinderer. And so we've shown other babies neutral events paired with valenced events, where there's a character who does something nice, and then there's another character who does the same physical behavior, but it doesn't end up helping anyone. And we found that at 6 months and at 10 months, babies seem to show a preference for helpers over over neutral characters, suggesting an independent positive evaluation of helping. And at the same ages, an independent negative evaluation of hindering, suggesting that by 6 months of age at least, babies are both liking helping and disliking hindering. With 3-month-olds, though, we've done the same exact studies and found that, if anything, their tendency to look longer at helpers versus hinderers is driven entirely by an aversion to hinderers. So when we compare pro-social versus neutral characters, they don't distinguish them at all. But when we compare neutral to antisocial characters, they distinguish them at the same rate. Strong aversion, it seems, to the hinderers, maybe what's driving the preference for helpers when it's helpers versus hinderers in the other conditions. Okay, so it seems like the negative information might be particularly strong early on. However, we see evidence of independent evaluation of prosocial characters by 6 months. At least in the Hill paradigm, we haven't actually examined that in the other paradigms. Okay, so if this is your infant, and this is my nephew, so he's always my infant, even though he's 12. what is going on in your head when you're thinking helper equals good and hinderer equals bad? What is driving that preference? Well, one of the things to point out is that it's a third-party judgment, so none of these characters are actively helping or hindering the baby right then and there, suggesting that they're generating the evaluations even though they're not standing to gain or lose right then and there from these interactions. But there's still many possibilities for what babies are attending to here, and one of them is not actually moral or even social at all. Maybe there are just certain physical aspects of the displays that we show babies that they like versus dislike that happen to be correlated with helpers versus hinderers. Maybe babies just prefer things that push up versus push down, or leave balls on stages versus take them away. Babies really love balls, so you can imagine them liking someone who leaves a ball on a stage versus takes it away. Or maybe they like opening boxes versus slamming them closed. That doesn't seem to be the case because in all the studies I've shown you so far, we've had control conditions where we remove the helping, hindering aspect of the actions and just leave the pushing up versus pushing down, ball leaving versus taking, opening versus closing. And in fact, we don't find a systematic preference for either one. In fact, in the box show, what we're likely to find is that they like the guy who slams the box closed because most babies find it funny, not in a harming context. So what that means is there's something more than just the physical nature of the actions that babies are responding to, but it's still pretty unclear what beyond that physical nature is happening. So one possibility is that babies have some kind of sense that, there's a typo here, facilitates an agent's path of motion. So perhaps babies like those who facilitate motion paths, some kind of very simple analysis. And to ask this question, we showed babies the hill scenario, and we showed it to them in two different ways. In one case, the climber moved up and down the hill, just like in the videos I've shown you before, and he looked up the hill while he was moving up the hill. And so his movements looked consistent with the goal to reach the top of the hill, presumably because he was also looking where he was going. Other sets of babies saw exactly the same physical motions, so the character moving more and more up the hill, but he was actually looking backwards, downhill, as he was moving upward. And we thought that even though his path of motion was upward, that it wasn't consistent with the goal of moving upward because he's essentially looking behind him. So it would be sort of like me doing this. It wouldn't necessarily be clear which direction I was interested in if I wasn't looking where I was going. Okay. So what we found in 4 conditions is that babies always preferred the helper when the guy was looking up the hill, and they never preferred the helper when the guy was looking down the hill while he was moving upward. So this led us to conclude that it isn't just simply facilitating a path of motion, because the path of motion was exactly the same in all of these conditions, suggesting that it's a bit more like facilitating an actual goal. And if the goal cues are screwed up because the looking isn't in the right direction, babies stop preferring the helper in this case. Okay. So it seems to be social, and it seems to be about unfulfilled goals. But of course, infants' social preference for helpers versus hinderers need not be anything close to baby or adults' moral preference, that someone should act in a particular way and not in other ways, for example. So other approaches to this question that we've tried to do are to sort of pick away at the things that we would think of as being required for a moral judgment and seeing which babies go with. Okay. So an important facet of moral judgments is the intention-outcome distinction, that it's the good thing is to have the goal to help others and to not have the goal to harm others, whether or not we end up helping them or harming them. So accidental harm is not so bad as intentional harm, and failed attempts to help are still pretty good, because sometimes everyone will fail at their pro-social intention. Okay, so babies in every study I've shown you so far could have been evaluating either the outcome for the protagonist, which was always good when the helper got involved and always bad when the hinderer got involved, or the intention of the helper and hinderer, because they were confounded, right? Importantly, kids have been notoriously bad at privileging intentions in moral judgments, at least when using explicit kinds of questioning. That said, lots of studies in infant social cognition for several decades now have been suggesting that babies do understand intentions. They can extract the attention information out of the actions of others, suggesting that it was at least possible that babies are focusing on the intentions of the helpers and hinderers as opposed to the outcomes that the protagonist experiences. Okay, so we have looked at 3 cases of where intentions and outcomes are deconfounded: accidental helping and harming, failed attempts to help and harm, and ignorant helping and harming. Okay, so in the first case, babies are shown very similar puppet shows, regardless of what condition they're in. But sometimes the actions are helpful, and sometimes they're harmful. And sometimes the actions are intentional, and sometimes they're accidental. So I'm going to show you the helping condition, and then I'll explain why the hindering condition is super similar with just a slight tweak. So, sorry guys, I know you're... This character tries but fails to grab something off the shelf. He fails. The dog pushes the shelf over so that the leopard can get his toy, and then the dog grabs another toy and runs off stage. Okay, but importantly, this should look intentional. He was on stage watching the guy try but fail to get the object, and then he goes over to the shelf and pushes it down pretty intentionally. The toy lands right in front of the leopard, allowing him to get it. So here's the accidental version of the same thing. So the dog leaves the stage, so he's not watching any of this. Now he comes back. He sees the dog. So this is supposed to look like he was just going for the duck, and he happened to knock the shelf over along the way, allowing the protagonist to get his goal, but that wasn't part of his intention. The hindering is all exactly the same, except that the goal of the leopard is to put the toy on the shelf, and he eventually succeeds at doing that, and so now knocking the shelf over ends up harming him, ends up reversing his goal to put the toy on the shelf. Okay? But everything else is exactly the same. So what we found is that babies' preference for the intentional versus the accidental dog differed depending on the condition. So in the helping condition, babies were more likely to choose the intentional shelf pusher versus the accidental shelf pusher, suggesting they think intentional helping is better than accidental helping. And we found the reverse in the hindering condition. So when the pushing the shelf over was mean and hindering, babies preferred the accidental pusher to the intentional pusher. So the events in these conditions are actually extremely similar to each other, and the intentional versus accidental cases are extremely similar to each other. They're doing exactly the same thing, resulting in exactly the same outcome, and yet babies are distinguishing them based on the cues to what their intentions were. Okay. So the second case in which we've distinguished intention from outcome is the case of failed attempts. So here's a failed helper in the box show. Tried to help the guy open the box. They they struggled for a while together, and then they both failed. Okay, so this guy came and slammed on the box, intending to harm, but then the guy happened to get the box open anyway, and so this is our failed hinderer. We had 3 comparison types. So some babies saw characters where the intent was the same, but the outcome was different. So like a successful helper versus a failed helper, or a successful hinderer versus a failed hinderer. Other babies saw these 2 events shown together, so intention pitted against outcome. And finally, some babies saw characters who had the same intent where only the outcome differed, so like a successful helper versus a, oh, I screwed that up, didn't I? Okay, so the first round of babies saw successful helper versus failed hinderer, right? So the outcome's the same, but they have different intents. And in the last section, it's characters with the same intent, but the outcome differs, failed helper, successful helper, okay? Sorry about that. Okay, so in the cases in which intention was different but outcomes were the same, when the outcomes were both good, babies preferred a successful helper to a failed hinderer. And when the outcomes were both bad, they preferred a failed helper to a successful hinderer. What you might be saying is like, but yeah, we already know that they prefer successful helpers and prefer successful hinderers, so maybe that's what's going on. But it turns out that when you pit failed helpers versus failed hinderers, they still go with the character with the better intention, even though outcomes here are distinct, and even though in this case both characters are failing to achieve their intended outcome. Interestingly, we didn't find that babies distinguished characters when only outcomes differed. So both of them had the intention to be nice, and only one succeeded. Babies didn't distinguish the characters in this case, or at least not at the same rate they did in the case where the intentions differed. Okay. These were 8-month-old babies, and it suggests that they're using intention, privileging intention over outcome, and not actually using outcome to distinguish characters. Interestingly, we found that 5-month-olds failed at everything except successful helpers versus successful hinderers. This is consistent with other studies in social cognition suggesting that babies before 8 to 10 months of age just have trouble with any kind of failed attempt action, whether or not it's moral in nature. So it might be that babies just can't understand when intentions and outcomes are pitted against each other in any way, and so can't evaluate others mentalistically because the test cases require that they understand those actions. Okay. We had some other control conditions I can tell you about. But finally, judgments are still more mentalistic than what I've shown you so far. So as adults, we think that you don't have to cause a particular outcome in order to be considered good or bad. You only have to intend it, right? But also, the actions that are themselves prosocial and antisocial don't have to look any different. And the same action can be considered good or bad or neither, depending on various features of a situation. So my example of this is giving Brussels sprouts. Does anyone think that giving Brussels sprouts is nice? I think it's nice. I love Brussels sprouts, so giving Brussels sprouts to me is a really nice thing, and anyone can do it anytime. But if you were to give Brussels sprouts to other people in the room, right, they'd probably think you were mean, because they think Brussels sprouts are gross, right? And so it depends if you like Brussels sprouts, right? So the same exact action of giving Brussels sprouts can be good or bad if you like them or dislike them. And arguably, in the domain of how I'm evaluating the giver of Brussels sprouts, I really need to know whether the giver of Brussels sprouts knew that their target liked Brussels sprouts in order to make the evaluation, right? So if I have no idea whether or not Kelsey likes Brussels sprouts and I decide to give them to her, then you can't really blame me if she hates them because some people like them, right? you could imagine using like the base rate of liking Brussels sprouts in the population in order to determine whether or not I'm good or bad for giving Brussels sprouts. But it'd be pretty difficult to argue that I should be blamed if Kelsey happens to dislike them, right? Okay, so the idea is you need to know something about the target and their mental states, i.e. their preferences in this case, in order to know whether it's good or bad. And if you don't know, you can't really be blamed or praised for the behavior. Okay. So I've argued that this requires a representational second order goal attribution in order to do this kind of evaluation of somebody's pro-sociality or anti-sociality based on what they know about the preferences of a third party. You know, you guys can tell me if you agree. So here's the study. Babies watch as two elephants watch a lion puppet choose a duck over a flower. Okay? So the lion puppet looks at one, looks at the other, chooses the duck. On other trials, the locations of the toys are switched. Lion, once again, looks at one, looks at the other, chooses the duck. So this is repeated another 2 times, and the idea is that no matter where the objects are, the lion always goes for the duck. Okay? So now, unfortunately, the lion experiences not being able to get through the wall because there's doors put in the castle wall, and he expresses his trappedness, which makes half the babies fuss out in the study because they find his hair very scary. But anyway, and occasionally, not occasionally, half the time, the duck is in the last place that the lion found it, and half the time it's in the other place. So the lion doesn't know where his duck is, and he can't get at it. Okay, so now we see test events where the lion once again expresses his upsetness, and then one puppet gives him access to the toy he preferred. And on the other trials, the other puppet gives him access to the toy he didn't prefer. Now, importantly, because sometimes the toy that he preferred is in the near location, the nice guy moves a short ways. Sometimes it's in the far location, so the nice guy would have to move a long ways. Like, that's all counterbalanced across babies and doesn't influence their preferences. So that was just one condition that we showed babies. We called it the preference knowledge condition because the lion had a preference for the duck over the flower, or the flower over the duck, depending on the baby. And the elephants were sitting there watching him the whole time, and so they arguably knew that he liked the duck over the flower. Okay. In the preference no knowledge condition, everything was exactly the same except in the first grasping preference events, the lion did the very same thing, always preferred the duck, but the elephants were not there, so they didn't know that the lion preferred the duck over the flower. So here, the lion had a preference, but the elephants didn't know about it. And finally, we had the no preference knowledge condition, where this has been used in basic baby social cognition tasks, where the lion is still repeatedly grasping the duck over and over again, and every time it moves, he always grasps the duck, but there's no alternative object. And so babies couldn't infer that he prefers the duck. They might just think, oh, a toy, awesome, a toy. Right? And so during test events, there is now the flower, and so neither the baby nor the elephants should know that this guy prefers the duck because there's not been sufficient evidence to suggest that he prefers the duck over the flower because they've never seen him choose the duck over the flower before. Okay? Okay. So, in the second order representational idea of you can only be praised or blamed if there's a goal and somebody knows about it. The elephants should only be differentially good or bad in the preference knowledge condition, not in the other two conditions. Okay, so that's exactly what we found. Babies preferred the character who got him access to the duck only in the preference knowledge condition, not in the other two conditions, suggesting that, like with the Brussels sprouts case, they needed to know about the the target of their action and their goals in order to be praised or blamed for facilitating or blocking them. The other thing that this study does is control for lots of other low-level explanations for babies' responses. For example, in the no preference knowledge condition, the path of motion to the object is facilitated or blocked in equal measure. But in that case, like facilitating you getting a toy you touched before isn't nice because it wasn't your preferred object, for example. Okay. Okay. Now, when did I start?
At 8:35.
8:35.
So
Okay.
you're at 36.
Oh, okay, cool. I think I have like 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So another thing about moral judgments, in addition to intentional versus unintentional actions being really critical, is that sometimes we think it's good to intentionally block goals, right? So we are able to evaluate actions in context, and we think that sometimes intentional goal facilitating is bad and goal blocking is good. So for example, you might have a bad or a dangerous goal. This child clearly wants to stick a knife into a socket, but it would be not morally good to help him. And also you might imagine that somebody deserves punishment for bad behavior they did in the past. Okay, so we have examined the punishment one just because punishment is such a key part of this evolution of cooperative systems idea that, generally speaking, you should like those who are good, except there needs to be room for punishing those who previously did bad in order to stabilize cooperative systems. So we've looked at this quite a bit. Okay. So for example, when we see others who deserve punishment, we will often positively evaluate those who do the punishment, even though technically the punishment is intentional goal blocking or intentional harming. Okay, so to ask this of infants, we've shown the 2-act plays where babies see only one of each of 4 events. In the first act, there's a protagonist who tries to open a box, and he's either helped to open the box, or he's both helped to open the box and prevented from opening the box by a helper and hinderer. If you think about this in terms of deservingness, the helper here deserves reward, and the hinderer deserves punishment. Then, rather than having them choose between the helper and the hinderer now, as we would typically do, babies then watch more shows involving either the helpful character from phase 1, the guy who helped open the box, or the unhelpful character from phase 1, the guy who slammed the box closed. Okay, and both characters, these are 2 separate conditions of babies, are helped and hindered when they drop their ball. Okay, so in the prosocial target condition, we definitely thought that babies should prefer the giver to the taker because they always prefer givers, even when they don't know anything about this target. And in this case, this target deserves help because he was nice to somebody else before. In the antisocial target condition, we were less sure what they would do because now the local valence of them preferring giving is sort of competing with the broader valence of this guy deserving punishment. Yeah? Okay. So what we found is that 19-month-old babies indeed preferred the guy who gave or helped the prosocial target, and they flipped to preferring the guy who took from or hindered the antisocial target. We found exactly the same pattern at 8 months of age, and when we first ran the study with 5-month-olds, we found that they failed. So they preferred the giver to anyone, givers to prosocial guys and givers to antisocial guys. And one possibility is that the ability to sort of evaluate action in context emerged between 5 months and 8 months. The other possibility was that the study was just too hard because we only showed 5-month-olds one instance of each act in phase 1. And we thought, like, well, that's really hard for a 5-month-old. Maybe by the time they got to phase 2, they were like, oh, puppets, forgetting who done what to whom before. So we reran the study basically habituating babies to the box events before we showed them the ball events, just to try to give them a really strong foundation of this is the nice guy and this is the mean guy. And indeed, when we did that, and then showed them one giving and one taking event, babies preferred the giver to the prosocial target, but flipped to preferring the taker of the antisocial target, just like the older babies had done. So that suggested to us that they can always do context-based evaluations if they can remember who did what in the previous events. Okay. We also, in this case, checked and observed no differences between babies with and without older siblings. This is not like the best question of how your experience influences your evaluations, but arguably babies without older siblings at 4.5 months old are not seeing a lot of overt punishment of others' bad behaviors, whereas babies with older siblings might be seeing a bunch more. And we didn't find any differences between babies at any age, whether they had older siblings or not, in terms of their rate of choosing the helper of the helper and the hinderer of the hinderer. Okay. Okay, but maybe babies here are just valence matching. So, as I just said, helper of helper, hinderer of hinderer, those sort of line up nicely. The valence is matched across the events. But of course, as adults, we think that your causal role in a moral event is critical in terms of whether you're a good guy or a bad guy versus a beneficiary or a victim. So for example, this guy who slammed on the box when the guy was trying to open it is the bad guy. He deserves punishment. But this guy is the victim of the bad behavior, and he definitely doesn't deserve punishment, and if anything, he deserves like protection, right? Okay, so we reran all of these studies rather than using prosocial targets versus antisocial targets. We used victim targets, and so we thought that if babies were just simply valence matching, then they should like the hinderer of anyone involved in a bad action, regardless of whether he did the bad action or received the bad action. But if babies are doing more than valence matching, maybe thinking that somebody deserves a particular action, then they should not prefer the hinderer of the victim. And that's what we found. So these are the antisocial target conditions that I've already shown you. And then when it's a victim target, you can see that babies systematically flipped back to preferring the giver to the victim rather than the taker, suggesting that they're not just doing single valence matching, rather they're thinking that bad guys deserve punishment. Or at least they're liking those who perform the punishment to the bad guys. Okay, so just a quick aside before I move on to the last thing I want to tell you about, is that I've talked about this in terms of deservingness, but you would be totally right to say you've really not shown that babies understand deservingness. What they might be doing is saying something like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they dislike the hinderer, they detect someone else being mean to the hinderer, and they're like, that guy also dislikes the hinderer. Excellent, we agree, we should be friends, right? And indeed, in other studies, it's been shown that babies prefer those who are like them for various reasons, and indeed those who share their preferences for toys and foods, and this might be those who share their preferences for good guys and bad guys, right? We've shown this in other ways, and actually we'll see a talk later about some of this work. So I won't go into it more, but babies do seem to show enemy, my enemy is my friend type preferences. Okay, so essentially babies prefer prosocial to antisocial others from about 3 months. At first it seems to be based on negative information in particular. It seems to be based on mental states by about 8 to 10 months of age, and is sensitive to context potentially all along. Okay. So you might wonder whether any of this means anything in the life of an individual infant. Does it inform how babies interact with others? Does it inform who they learn from, etc.? And the section of my talk that I took out was a section telling you that yes, it does. So we found that toddlers are nicer to prosocial characters and meaner to antisocial characters, and that toddlers fail to adopt food preferences of mean guys, even though they readily adopt them of nice guys. So what I want to really quickly say in the next minute, okay, it might be more like 3 minutes, is does this predict anything about later development? And this work is all done by my grad student, Edda Tan. Why are you laughing? Like I forgot? Oh, the picture. Okay. It's like, did I say something wrong? Okay. So the question is, do these early preferences map onto other broader social, cognitive, emotional, or moral developmental trajectories? Are they predictive of any individual differences in moral and social functioning? So continuity has been shown in recent years from infant measures of various things to, say, preschool or even later measures in mathematical cognition, attention, theory of mind, empathy. So we just kind of wanted to ask, do these tests predict anything? And if so, what do they predict? In order to prefer the helper in this case, a child has to understand the protagonist has a goal, care that the protagonist has a goal, recognize the intentions of the helper and the hinderer, care about the intentions of the helper and the hinderer, and then do all kinds of lower level things like pay attention, organize their reaching response, remember who did what to whom, distinguish colors, etc., etc. Okay. All right, I'm just going to go quickly. So in this study, we had 65 children who participated in 2 or more baby studies, like the ones that I've shown you, in their first 2 years. The mean age at participation was 1 year. And then they had grown up to be at least 3, but the mean preschool age of examination was 4 years exactly. Just so you know, 2 of the kids in the sample had received an autism diagnosis by the time they were assessed again. And so we have analyses with the kids in the sample and with them not in the sample. Okay. For the studies, all we required was that the studies had some moral relevance. So there was like helping versus hindering in some way. And we needed the study to have a clear hypothesis. So we didn't use any control conditions, essentially, where we predicted no effects. And we excluded procedure errors, parental interference, no choice, any like failure of the study itself. But we included everything else. So we included pilot data, we included things we hadn't published, we included studies that didn't work at a group level, etc. So basically, like, because we had so few kids that were even, actually these 65 kids are like 90% of the kids who were even eligible for the sample, we used everything we possibly could. Okay. So we gave each kid a weighted with hypothesis rate based on how they had done as an infant. So basically for each study they were in, if they went with the hypothesis, like preferred the helper, for example, they were given a 1. If they went against the hypothesis, preferred the hinderer, they were given a -1. And then we multiplied each of those 1 and -1 scores by the effect size of that sample. Because we wanted to say, like, if 90% of the babies preferred the helper and you didn't, it should count against you more than if only 40% of the babies preferred the helper, right? That makes sense. Okay, and then we average the scores together, giving each kid a weighted with hypothesis rate. So that's just the histogram of the breadth of weighted with hypothesis rate scores we had. We also looked at rate of habituation across all the baby studies they've been in to try to get a measure of, a very loose measure of IQ. And we looked at fuss out rate to try to get a very loose measure of emotionality. Okay. We examined 1 measure of moral development, according to our analysis, the inventory of callous and emotional traits for preschoolers, which is thought to predict psychopathy, essentially. So it measures remorse, telling right from wrong, deceitfulness, manipulativeness, items like, my child does not care who he or she hurts to get what he or she wants. Yes or no? My child does not seem to know right from wrong. Agree or disagree? So that was our moral development scale, but then we also had several more broad social development scales. We had the SRS, which is a parent report measure of autism. My child is aware of what others are thinking or feeling. My child gets frustrated trying to get ideas across. Then we had the child behavior checklist, which essentially is reporting problem behavior. My child is unhappy without good reason. And then violent adaptive behavior scales. We had communication scales, so like language development, but also communication more broadly, and socialization scale. Okay. So here are the results. We did hierarchical multiple regressions of each questionnaire in preschool, controlling for various things, like preschool test age, number of infant studies, average habituation rate, and fuss out rate. And then we looked at weighting with hypothesis rate and gender, as well as their interaction, because we thought that there might be differences across gender in terms of world developmental trajectories. So, I know I'm taking way too long, but basically we found that in the typically developing sample, so kids who had not received a diagnosis of anything, in particular, it was 2 kids who received autism diagnoses that we removed from the sample, we found a significant effect only for the ICU. So basically babies who had performed less in the direction of the hypothesis as infants, on average at 1 year of life, looked like they had more CALs and unemotional traits at age 4, as reported by their parents, but we found no effects for any of the other scales. But when we included the kids with autism, we found effects for everything. So the kids with autism had indeed done amongst the worst as infants. They didn't look different in habituation rate or fuss out rate actually, which was interesting, but they had looked worse in terms of their rate of habituation, or sorry, their rate of choosing with hypothesis. And so indeed, when you add those kids to the sample, all the effects are significant and in the predicted directions. But in the typically developing, we only found results on the moral development scale. Okay, so that's it. It suggests it's tapping something about moral competence in infancy in particular, but we need to keep studying this. My new grad student Rachel is hoping to do a long-term, large-scale longitudinal study looking at babies' responses over time and what it predicts. But that was an exciting first result. Okay, I'm done, and just to say that all of these findings are consistent with theories of the evolution of cooperation and suggest that babies are sensitive to the kinds of things that they should be sensitive to that would support our cooperative systems. Okay, thanks very much.